President Biden met with China's President Xi Jinping for 4 hours earlier this week and said he made, quote, real progress in relations between the two superpowers. After going an entire year without speaking, the two leaders agreed to call each other directly when needed. Our next guest was in attendance at Wednesday's dinner gala with President Xi. Joining us right now in an exclusive interview is Bridgewater founder and CIO, mentor Ray Dalio. Ray, it's great to see you this morning. I think everybody would love your own readout, if you will, from that dinner. We've heard readouts from the meeting that took place between the president, some of the U.S. government officials making certain statements about what they saw happening. But what did you see happening at that dinner?
I'll tell you about the dinner just in a second. I think I just want to emphasize that, you know, I'm a markets guy trying to think about the world ahead, and there are five main forces that are at work, and they're interrelated. And that is the debt, money, economic force, the internal conflicts that we're having, particularly the populism of the left and right, the geopolitical that we're seeing, most importantly, between the United States and China. Then, of course, there's climate and its costs, and number five is technology. And so I think we have to see that all interacting. The dinner was mostly a gathering of old friends at a moment where there was stepping back of the risks of war. I was there last in March, and at that time there was a very clear risk of a military war. And I think that that really concerned both sides, and there was a stepping back. I think that dinner had to do with relationships over a long period of time. In my case, I started going there 39 years ago. They didn't have any money. I didn't go for money. I went for the relationship. Curiosity at first. Then over a period of time, my son, when he was 11, went to a Chinese school because it was interesting. We evolved and we developed good relationships. Over that time, others did. A lot of people had friendships with people who they were working together to help to develop relations, to help the economy and so on. So it was sort of a gathering of Chinese and Americans who knew each other, and there was an element of warmth and an element of relief that there was a stepping back from the bad risks of war. Right. Nobody wants war, right?
Nobody wants war, Ray. Let me ask you this, and I want to get to monetary policy and interest rates and how you're thinking about it. And I know you've been thinking deeply and writing about some new perspectives on where we are right now. But in terms of the military risk, one of the conundrums appears to be, and it came out a little bit in the readout between the meeting that the president had with President Xi, meaning President Biden and President Xi, was that there still was very much on the table China's ambition to take over Taiwan. Maybe not by military force, but some other way. And there's a big question about what the U.S. would do if that were to happen. What do you think the risks are that that does happen now? And I don't know what kind of time frame we're now talking about, but also what Western companies and multinational businesses that do business in China would ultimately have to do if that were the case.
What I'm trying to share with you is a perspective, to some extent the Chinese perspective, that there's a good back and forth. But to some extent, Taiwan was promised at the end of World War II to be returned to China, and everybody agreed on that. During 1895, the Japanese came in, took Taiwan. At the end of World War II, it was given back, and everybody agreed that there's one China, and Taiwan's part of China. And that issue is a very, very important issue. It's a territorial issue that relates to China, and very much part of the relationships. If there is not a statement of independence, if the United States doesn't say that there is an independent Taiwan, I believe that you're going to continue to see this issue be a thorny issue a source of tension, but not something that's going to be beyond that source of tension. If the United States or other parties operated where there was a declaration of that, or that there were major military actions, then that would raise the temperature. I do not expect that there would be any initiation on China's part. Tensions, of course. I think the whole environment, what was the main point of what happened in that meeting between Biden and Xi? The main point is that we're now in an environment of fierce competition, which is different than being right at the brink of war. When they look down the abyss and think about war, literally, war, terrible. When they looked down the abyss, there was a step back from that abyss with the idea of a very fierce competition. Now, this will be a Chinese type of competition as well. If you look at the history of the perception of war, they find that going into a military war, if you go into a military war, you must not have been very smart because you didn't win without going into a war. And that is that game that starts with, was described with the art of war, is a game in which there's a strategic operation. So that game is still full on. This is not a change in the basic structural issue of a rising power and an existing power and a struggle for who has what say. That will continue. But fortunately, the risks of a military war have been reduced by this.